Over the years, a lot has been said about Carthage. This ancient city on the North African coast is most famous for being the grand enemy of Rome during the Punic Wars. You may have heard of the military genius of Hannibal Barca and his crossing of the Alps with his army of elephants. You may have heard of a maritime and commercial superpower exerting dominance over Mediterranean trade. And you may have heard of their inevitable defeat by the Roman general Scipio, how Carthage must be destroyed. But amid these tales oft romanticized, one far more disturbing story has made its way through history. For from the writings of ancient authors, we are told of sacrifices made to foreign gods. Sacrifices not of birds and beasts and bread, but of children, whose lives were exchanged for divine favor. This horrifies us today, and it horrified these ancient writers too, but is it true? Did these sacrifices really occur, or was this the invention of Carthage's enemies, whose accounts are the only ones to survive into present day? Welcome everyone, my name is Solomon. This is Human Sacrifice in Ancient Carthage. One of the problems we encounter when discussing anything about Carthage is the strong bias in our sources. Pretty much every surviving source talking about them comes to us from the Greeks and Romans, who, having spent centuries fighting the Carthaginians, were not predisposed towards accuracy. I'm looking at you, Diodorus. You know you spend too much time thinking about this stuff when you've got beef with a guy who's been dead for 2,000 years. Some authors, like Diodorus and later Plutarch, give graphic descriptions of how the Carthaginians would sacrifice their nobly born children in fire, or purchase children from the poor to be sacrificed, and would play music to drown out the screams. These are visceral images, but we have reason to doubt them. Both of these authors are writing long after the final destruction of Carthage, and both have an emotional investment in the story that they're telling. And written records of human sacrifice in Carthage are rather rare, with ancient authors for the most part either giving these graphic descriptions or not mentioning it at all, leaving us turning to archaeology for answers. In the early 20th century, two French colonial officials in Tunisia discovered the remains of an ancient Punic cemetery in the city of Carthage. Excavations revealed the remains of an enclosed sanctuary filled with urns containing cremated remains and marked by funerary monuments and inscriptions. Further research showed that this is one of the oldest places in the ancient city, having been in use since the end of the 8th century. But this site was separate from the main Punic necropolis. In fact, it was positioned at the very edge of the city, far from the Bursa and the rest of the city's religious monuments. More than that, the human remains found there were not from adults, they were exclusively from infants, and the inscriptions found at the site bear the term Molk, which in the Punic language simply means offering. It wasn't the only one either, as similar sites were found across the Western Mediterranean in sites of Carthaginian influence, all containing the same infant burials and offering inscriptions. It seemed that these were the places of sacrifice that ancient authors talked about, where children were burned as offerings to the gods Tanit and Baal-Hamon. Scholars began calling these sites Tophets after a biblical location associated with human sacrifice, but not everyone was convinced. Analysis of the remains showed that the vast majority of infants buried in the Tophet were either stillborn or died shortly after birth, suggesting a death by natural causes due to the high infant mortality rate of ancient societies. Some have argued that this points not towards sacrifice, but towards a substitution of the dead in place of living victims. Also present were large amounts of remains from young animals, perhaps offered instead of human children as happened in the East. Scholars like Helena Bonashu-Safar put forward the idea that the Tophet was not a place of sacrifice, but simply a graveyard for children who died prematurely. As evidence, they point to the almost total absence of children's graves from the main necropolis of the city. These discoveries line up with the other Tophets too. On the Tophet on Tharos, the Carthaginian city on the island of Sardinia, only 2% of the infants buried there were found to be more than just a couple months old. But wait, you can see the runtime of this video, you know we're not done yet, so what's the counter-argument? Well, while these numbers are true to the Tophet's earlier periods of use through to the 5th century, the later periods show something else. Starting in the 4th century, the age of children buried in Tophets increases. Now, instead of just infants, children aged 2 to 4 years are common, alongside the expected infant burials. In addition, the amount of animal remains drops dramatically. In the early period, animal remains made up 1/3 of the total burials, but by the 4th century that had dropped to only 10%, the rest being human children. And these were all still accompanied by the Molk offering inscriptions, now becoming highly formulaic. They all follow a very similar structure, asking the gods to grant their favor to the one who has just offered up their child. This demonstrates that the Tophets were not merely graveyards for children, and that the nature of the burials was meant to be transactional with the gods. Far from a declining practice, it seems that in the final centuries of Carthage's existence, human sacrifice became more common and frequent than ever before. The Tophet at Carthage had been in continuous use since the 8th century BC all the way up until the final destruction of the city in the year 146, and in the last 200 years alone, more than 20,000 cinerary urns had been deposited there. it also seems that the demographic associated with Molk sacrifice had shifted in later periods. In the earliest stages, epigraphy seems to indicate that the practice only existed among society's upper classes, but in the later periods it had opened up to merchants, artisans, freedmen, and the rest of the general population. But why? Why the surge in the popularity of human sacrifice? To answer that, we have to look to the east. Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians and inherited their language and many of their religious customs. One of the customs associated with the Phoenicians in the east was human sacrifice, though it seems to have been a rarity, only practiced in times of great danger for the good of the city. By the 4th century, the cities of the Phoenician homeland had lost all sense of autonomy, either being destroyed or placed firmly under the heel of Hellenistic kings. It's possible that in the West, the practice of Molk sacrifice was increasingly being associated with a sense of Phoenician identity and prestige. And so some have speculated that the simultaneous increase in Molk sacrifices in the West was a way of clinging to that identity and lending pedigree to established communities. The possession of a Tophet was a mark of great distinction, limited to the largest and wealthiest settlements. The continuing significance of the Tophet in Carthage and in other Western Phoenician settlements shows the continuing importance of Levantine heritage to their citizens. It was a symbol of the vibrancy and coherency of a Western Phoenician world that was beginning to emerge from the shadow of its beleaguered Levantine cousins. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you stick around for more. If you're interested in this topic, you can check the description where I've put sources and suggested readings, and consider leaving me an interaction while you're there. It helps the algorithm know what type of content to recommend, and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks again, till next time.